Hey everyone, good morning. I think it's Thursday. I've sort of lost track of what the day is. I hope all of you are doing okay given the circumstances. I did just want to say a few things. Most of you have completed the quiz. If you need any extra time, I'm willing to extend the deadline like I have been for most assignments. So if you don't meet that deadline today to get the quiz finished, go ahead and just send me an email, let me know. I'll extend the deadline. You can complete the quiz. Um, I did make announcements about the second paper. Again, I'm only requiring the second paper to be 3 to 5 pages. What I did last night was just went ahead and uploaded some prompts. You'll notice that there are two longer prompts that deal with Arendt. Those readings start next week. Um, those are some longer prompts I used when I previously taught Arendt in another class, and so it kind of combines. Some of them combined Arendt and the Martin Luther King readings. So you may be interested in writing about those. And I just posted a few other ideas at the bottom of that in that announcement that I made. Similarly, you can write about any of the prompts from the first paper. You do not have to write on a new prompt, but some of you may, like I said, you may have left your books behind on Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau. You may have left them in campus. You may not have them with you because a lot of those prompts from the first paper obviously deal with Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau. And you may just not want to write about that stuff anymore. You may have written about it once and you want to write about something new. And so you've got a lot of options. I've tried to give you some options, so please take a look at that. If you want to have a Zoom meeting between now and when the paper's due to talk about your paper prompt, I will. I can send you a link. I've met now with several different students and it works fine. And we can talk about the second paper you want to write. So just let me know. I'm flexible, so just let me know. With that said, I want to transition then into talking some more about Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail. There's a lot going on in the reading for Friday. I said a little bit about kind of the historical context of the letter on Monday, sort of who he was responding to in terms of those clergymen, and then I got into a little bit of the beginning of the letter itself and some of the distinctions that King starts to make. He's largely responding to the kind of criticism that says, um, that they wish he would kind of wait his turn, that the time isn't right to engage in civil disobedience. And King is kind of, obviously responding and saying, look, it's a privilege to be able to say that the time isn't right. It's a sign of a lot of privilege to be able to say that to people who have been oppressed for, since the founding of the country, essentially. And so, King is just kind of expressing his frustration with those who would look to King and the law breaking and civil disobedience and say, it's not your time. Let the legal process play out. Don't cause such a disruption. And King kind of says, look, if not now, when? And he famously says too that those who are interested in maintaining the status quo are not simply going to voluntarily give up their oppression, give up their privilege. They're not just going to simply voluntarily do it. And so it must be demanded from the oppressed. We must go out in the streets. We must be seen. We must be heard. We must be in front of the cameras. We must show the police beating us as we sit there and take the violence from the police. It's a dramatization that must be played out in front of the American public so that we can get more people on our side to demand our rights with us. And so, that's the real heart. That's how intense this is for King, how personal it is for King. And so, what we get in though in today's reading is some more sort of conceptual distinctions, some more philosophical distinctions that King is discussing. And in particular, Monday's reading had ended with King kind of reflecting on, how do we tell that a law is unjust? He implicit within civil disobedience, or presupposed with any act of civil disobedience, is that we can make clear distinctions between recognizing laws as unjust and laws that are just, because indeed it seems as though the very justification for civil disobedience is that the law you're breaking is fundamentally unjust. And so the question then is, the presupposition, at least there, is that somehow the law is based on some higher moral code that we can use to evaluate the law. And that's how we determine what's so unjust has a moral meaning, not only a legal meaning. The law is unjust because the unjustness reveals itself in the evaluation of the law according to some kind of higher moral standard. So we've got really a kind of relationship between some really big political concepts here, between the morality of the law itself, and justice. And King is saying that it's really kind of obvious to be able to tell, not obvious, but he thinks there are some clear demarcating lines that will tell us when a law is just and when a law is unjust. And this is kind of at the heart of civil disobedience itself, this assumption that there are unjust laws. And it's not, I'm not sort of posing this to say that there aren't unjust laws. There are obviously unjust laws. Intuitively, they're unjust. We just feel that they're unjust. The question is, once we get beyond that initial feeling and that intuition that a law is unjust, what kind of philosophical work can we do to explain why the law is unjust with reasons and arguments rather than just this feeling that the law is unjust? And so that's what King is up to today, and this really does get to the heart of civil disobedience. So at the beginning of where I had you stop for Wednesday and today, you know, King's talking about different ways to think about the law as being just or unjust. He references Saint Augustine, who was a very famous Christian philosopher, and King asks, how does one determine whether a law is just or unjust? So one way is one that squares with the moral law or the law of God, and that's how one is just, and one that is out of harmony with the moral law is unjust. And so, that, unfortunately, that bringing in the language of God, even though King is clearly a deeply, deeply spiritual and religious person, indeed he was a pastor, that's not going to immediately kind of get people to recognize, yes, you recognize laws that are in line with laws of God, but I don't. I'm not religious. And so how else can you convince me? So there's more that he says, right? So a just law is any law that uplifts human personality. And an unjust law is any law that degrades human personality. And I think what he means by human personality is this, a sense of integrity, the sense of the wholeness of the person. That somehow a law that disrespects the wholeness of the person, that interferes with the person to be a whole person, to be fully integrated, in the sense of integrity, that might be a clear sign that a law is unjust. So what kinds of laws? Obviously, in the context of what King is up to with civil disobedience, segregation laws damage the human personality. They relegate persons to the status of things. So I should say here, I'm referencing specifically the notes, right? So anytime a law treats a person rather as not as a subject or as a person with integrity, but as an object, as a thing, that itself will be a sign that a law is unjust. And that gets to a distinction. If you've ever read Kant makes the distinction that human beings have dignity. Things and objects do not have dignity. Things are simply replaceable. This pen, if I could just go get another pen, and there's not real much difference. One might write better than the other, but at the end of the day, this doesn't have any intrinsic worth. Whereas I am not simply replaceable by another human being. I have dignity. And so therefore, a law that regards me as an object and not as a creature with dignity is one that is unjust. And of course, racist, segregationist laws are clearly laws that do that. So we've got some traction here. Laws that regard people as objects are going to be laws that are unjust, and laws that respect human dignity are clearly laws that are going to be just. Now there's some further there's some further distinctions that King makes here. He says, an unjust law is a code that a numerical or power majority group compels a minority group to obey, but does not make binding on itself. So it's difference made legal. Now that's very clear. A just law is a code that a majority compels a minority to follow, and that it is unwilling to follow itself. So that the just law is one that the majority compels a minority to follow, but they are also willing to follow. So that's sameness made legal. So there's another distinction about justness and injustice. Legalizing difference is unjust. Legalizing sameness is just. Similarly above, treating persons as objects is unjust. Treating persons as creatures with dignity is just. And so we've got a number of ways here that we're trying to kind of make these moral claims that allow us to recognize when the law is just and when the law is unjust. Now, I submit, and I think King is submitting, that look, racist segregationist laws are the most obvious example of this. It's not, it feels as though it's not hard for us to disagree about the fact that those kinds of laws, they don't respect us as creatures with dignity. So there's one reason they're unjust, and they legalize difference. And there's another reason they're unjust. So we've got the two criteria that King is using here, and saying racist segregationist laws, where they apply to one group of people but not to another, are unjust. And I don't think a lot of us would disagree, right? That the question that I'm really kind of putting forward as we move into the Arendt reading next week, and thinking about King here, is it, yes, we have racist segregationist laws, and these are the paradigm examples of unjust laws. We don't really disagree about this. Reasonable people would not really disagree. That's not to say that in King's time there weren't, white supremacists, who would just easily say, "Oh, of course, segregationist laws are, unjust." Of course not. There are going to be, a small minority of racist individuals who will not simply concede that laws are unjust. But by and large, especially today, I think most of us can reasonably agree that segregationist laws, racist laws, are unjust. The question is, what do we do with other kinds of laws? Who else gets to claim that laws are unjust? I gave the example on the last day of class, for example. What about a group of abortion protesters who think that abortion should not be legal, and they gather in front of an abortion clinic, and they gather there and they refuse to let any women in who want an abortion, and they're claiming that the law that abortion is legal is unjust because it go back to King's laws. Now, of course, it depends upon deciding whether a fetus is a person, and so maybe you just think this isn't a good example. But those who are against abortion would say, look, this is not uplifting human personality. It's treating a baby as an object rather than a person. And now, again, you may think that is just more controversial, but nonetheless, those who are saying just that abortion laws are unjust, and they are engaging in civil disobedience, would not simply say, "Oh, of course," they might have as much of a claim to saying that laws are unjust as those who are protesting racist laws. And so I just trying to submit to you that this is complicated, that figuring out whether a law is just or unjust is complicated. And it's not just going to be always as obvious as in the case of racist, unjust laws, right? And so, anyways, I wanted to put that problem in front of you. I'll revisit that next week with Arendt, but I want to look at a little bit more about what King is saying in today's reading, and in particular, I want to look at this individual that King calls the white moderate. This is one of the most famous and well-known terms that King coins in this letter, the white moderate. And what does he mean by them? Well, this is who he's writing this letter to, right? This is the audience he has in mind. Keep in mind, and this is what I said before, King's audience is not the Ku Klux Klan leader or George Wallace, the racist governor of Alabama. King basically says, that's easy. I know they're racist. I know they're willing to come out and overtly tell me that they're racist and call me the N-word and things like that, right? So his concern is not with them. He knows where they stand. His concern is with the individual who seems sympathetic to their cause, the white moderate, who's sympathetic to the cause of racism, sympathetic to changing the law, but who is sympathetic, but yet is kind of lukewarm about engaging in civil disobedience. They're lukewarm about offering too much of their support. to these kinds of practices of civil disobedience. So they're sympathetic to the cause, but they're uncomfortable with the method that King is using to bring about the change that he's seeking, right? So and I think it's interesting to think about even today the language of the white moderate, and who might fit that. Who might fit the description of the white moderate today? Because this is kind of an archetype that hasn't really gone away. Those who would say they are sympathetic to a cause, but disagree with the method that is used to disagree with the method of bringing about the change, right? Those who would say, just, let the legal process play out. Don't engage in disruption, right? Things like that. Sympathetic to the cause, but don't support the methods used in favor of the cause. That's the key distinction, right? So what King says, right, and King says, I have here, it's a huge in bold here. Shallow misunderstanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute understanding from people of ill will. Absolute misunderstanding, lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright objection, right? So that's what he's talking about, the white moderate, right? So, and this quote here I have here, right? King goes on to say how I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in the stride towards freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I can't agree with your methods, right? Who paternalistically feels he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives in the myth of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait until a more convenient season. It's such a powerful, quotable lines here, right? And this is, I don't know how many of you sort of realized this before reading the letter from Birmingham jail, but King's problem is with these sort of white moderates, and I might even call them white liberals, right? White liberals in today's terminology. I'm trying to think of examples, but you can find plenty of examples of individuals even today. You might think of somebody like who's running for president right now, somebody like Joe Biden, who his past record has been brought up against him from this time period. Joe Biden is a white moderate. Joe Biden was a white moderate in the time period, and he remains so today. He kind of so that's one sort of prime example. Biden would say he's evolved on a lot of these issues, but during the time period, he would have been the kind of example that King would have had a problem with, right? Joe Biden got into politics around the time of all of this tension back in the 60s and 70s. So Joe Biden is a white moderate. So we have examples of this. People who, I try to think of examples of, think of Black Lives Matter, who I think in some ways many would argue is a kind of continuation of, many would argue Black Lives Matter is a kind of continuation of the civil rights movement, who are protesting police brutality, for example. And how would you feel if today that Black Lives Matter basically gathers in the street? They sit in the middle of the street, say maybe in Clemson themselves, and they sit there in the street, and you're trying to get to class, and they're there in the street. How would you feel? Would you say, I'm sympathetic to your cause, but I wish you wouldn't do it this way, right? How would you, I agree with the goal you seek, but I can't agree with your methods. Get out of my way. Don't sit in the streets because you're making me late to class. You're making me late to work. Things like that. Again, I'm not accusing you of that, but I think that is what King is talking about. So what about this distinction that King makes between negative peace and positive peace? So negative peace is simply what the white moderate would prefer. Negative peace is simply the absence of tension, whereas positive peace requires the presence of justice. It requires tension. So negative peace is simply the status quo. It is maintaining things as they are. It's a seeming peace, but it's not an actual peace, because for there to be peace, actual peace requires that unjust laws be broken. It requires that these unjust laws be undone. And in order for those laws to be undone, there must be tension. There must be fighting going on in order for this. So this distinction between negative and positive peace is a really well known one. From King. And I think it really gets at something that maybe we really do often think of peace, the concept of peace, as simply the absence of violence, the absence of any kind of tension. And so peace is just when everybody is kind of doing their thing. Peace is law and order. So every day, peace, we walk up and down the streets and we see and we say, wow, everything's calm, everything's fine, everything's great. Everybody's following the laws. But what if the laws people are following are a bunch of unjust laws, right? Is that really peace? No. Peace requires justice. That's the claim King is making here. So peace, for there to be peace, a condition in which we would say this is a peaceful condition, we must know that the laws are just and that there are no unjust laws on the books, right? So that's a crucial distinction that King is making, right? So let me just see a bit more here. What's going on in King? I think I'll be right back. So there's one more set of distinctions I want to talk about from the King reading, and it's towards the end when he's talking about means and ends. And so he's talking about non-violent means and ends. And King, so I'm reading here from the notes. King considers the supposed non-violence that the police have engaged in during the protests, and that the police ought to be commended for keeping order and preventing violence. A crucial distinction emerges out of this discussion. So again, King is referencing here the fact that maybe it's not as though all of the police have engaged in beating the protesters. Of course, you can find the videos, and again, if you watch the movie Selma, you've seen the police that use their clubs to beat these black individuals who are engaged in these protests and opening the fire hoses on them and things like that. But of course, some police are standing there right alongside them in solidarity with them, right? And so King wants to say, so though King himself vehemently subscribes to a philosophy of nonviolence in service of his ultimate goals, and the use of nonviolence is what allows his cause to remain a moral one, he asks whether nonviolence is always commendable. That is, to what extent should we praise those who seek to use morality, nonviolent means, as a justification for the preservation of injustice, right? It is one thing to use nonviolent means in the service of moral ends. It is another to use nonviolent means in the service of immoral ends, right? So King writes, I have consistently preached that nonviolence demands that with the means we use be as pure as the ends we seek. This means the means represent the end in process and the ideal in the making. There's no gap between the two. There can be no notion of the end justifying the means. However, I've tried to make it clear that it is wrong to use immoral means to attain moral ends. But now I must affirm that it is just as wrong to use moral means to preserve immoral ends. They have used the moral means of nonviolence to maintain the immoral end of racial injustice. Right, so King is saying here, we ought to not be too quick to simply praise the police officers who have simply stood by in solidarity with these black protesters, because at the end of the day, yes, they're not beating them with clubs and opening the fire hose on them, but they are at the end of the day using nonviolence, a moral means, simply to preserve a racist system, an unjust end, right? So there can't be a gap between your mean and your ends here. Your means have to be imminent in the ends, which is to say contained in your end, that there really is no gap between the means and the ends. Whereas clearly for the white police officers who are simply standing by in solidarity, they are fine with the protests as long as the protests don't disrupt the status quo and change the system. So they're using a moral means, nonviolence, to preserve an immoral system, which is the racist system, which maintains the status quo. So King is saying there has to be an imminent connection between means and ends, which is to say the means must be contained in the ends. It can't be ones where we just use the end to justify the means, right? And so the distinction between negative and positive piece that emerges in the discussion of the white moderate, and also this distinction between means and ends and nonviolence and violence and morality and immorality and how all those fit together is really crucial what King is saying here. And again, it's that question that I have there highlighted in the notes. To what extent should we praise those who seek to use morality as a justification for the presence of injustice? And that's a really crucial question. And I think King is saying we ought to be cautious in simply heaping praise upon a bunch of police officers who are so I remember, for example, I don't know if you how many of you remember back in 2014 in I was going to graduate school here in Southern Illinois, and there was the shooting of Michael Brown in St. Louis. And I remember the protesters sort of marching along, and you see these police officers marching with them in solidarity with them. But I think a lot of people portray, you see the images in the media of the news, and they're praising these police officers, saying, look, they're allowing these protesters to have their day, right? But would they really support the cause that which is to say their cause was to try to get justice for Michael Brown and have this police officer accused of murder, right? And King would ask there, well, would they really support that goal of the protest? Yes, they support the nonviolent protest, but ultimately they're doing it because they want to preserve the unjust system. Whereas if you were to ask them, do you support this protest because it is trying to send to jail a police officer who potentially engaged in an unjust killing, they would probably say no. So I think that kind of contextualizes the example today. Anyways, that's about all I have to say for King's letter. I really, the white moderate is such a crucial term, and I want you to kind of reflect on your own thoughts about racism. And think about the extent to which this came up in Charles Mills. Think about the extent to which you say, I don't see race, I'm colorblind. Think about the extent to which that implicates you in this category of white moderate. It's not a bad thing. I'm guilty of it because I want to strive and say I strive to see the world as nonviolent and or I strive to see the world as colorblind and that I don't see race. But to what extent does that kind of attitude implicate me in something like what King calls the white moderate? That if I say I don't see race, if I say that I am colorblind and that all human beings are equal, well then to what extent then when I see protesters um, engaging in law breaking or protest to try to fight against unjust laws, to what extent then, how does that inform my reaction? How am I going to react when I see protests going on? What am I going to say? Am I gonna be support? Am I gonna say, yeah, we shouldn't have racist laws, but you also shouldn't be, engaged in these protests that are disrupting my life. It's inconvenient for me. You should be fighting this in the courts, but not disrupting my life, right? And so, it's just the extent to which think about your own personal reaction to a group of protesters who are fighting an unjust law and they disrupt your life in some way. How are you going to feel and what kind of reaction are you going to have? Are you going to support their cause but not support their methods for fighting that cause? Or do you find yourself, yes, I support the cause, and yes, also I can imagine myself right there alongside them in the streets fighting? That's just a question I want to put in front of you. It's not a judgment against anyone. It's just trying to think about where do you fall? Would you fall into King's um, category of a white moderate? Because I think myself, I probably would at certain points in my life. I would probably be guilty of being a white moderate. So that's just a thought to consider. Anyways, that's all I have for now. I hope you're all doing well. And again, please reach out to me through email if you have any questions about anything, and I'll talk to you all soon.